Hello and welcome to the April Collective Impact webinar. We're so excited to have everyone here today. This is the second of the 2019 webinar series. Today, your hosts include Amelia Smythe, Kinkini Banerjee, and myself, Alyssa Spees from USBC. A little background on the series.
Alyssa, this is Amelia. I think we need to show your screen.
Great.
There we go.
Like I mentioned, our host today, Amelia Smythe, Kinkini Banerjee, and myself, Alyssa Spees. A little background on the series, made possible with funding from both CDC and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. The webinars are held every 2 months on even-numbered months on the fourth Tuesdays from 2 to 3 p.m. Eastern Time. So our next webinar will be at the end of June. And this is an opportunity to bring together state, territorial, and other coalitions and organizations to share best practices and news about collective impact models for collaborative work and change. So the webinar is open to all interested breastfeeding advocates, and you can find information about upcoming webinars as well as prior sessions on the USBC website at usbreastfeeding.org/collective-impact. And these webinars are set up as a series, so if you have registered for them once, you will receive auto reminders of each session before they start. And in addition, if you're not able to attend the series live, that you will get a link to the recording so that you can go watch it at a later date. To find archives of the past sessions, you can use the link from your reminder email or go to usbreastfeeding.org/collective-impact. And we've made it easier to find this on our website. So if you go to the US Breastfeeding homepage, you can click on webinars and go down to Collective Impact Webinar Series, and that'll take you to all of the information about upcoming and past sessions. So during today's session, all attendees are going to be in listen-only mode, and we will have a Q&A session after all panelists are done presenting. You can submit your questions at any time during the webinar. There is a questions box on your GoToWebinar control panel. So if you click on that, you can enter your question into that box, and then we will answer those during the Q&A session at the end. So you're all in listen-only mode, and again, the question box you can see. You can enter that in whenever a question comes up for you. And if you have any issues, you can either write that into the question box, or you can email office@usbreastfeeding.org, and we will try to help figure out any technical issues as quickly as we can. And with that, I will pass it over to Amelia. Okay.
Hey there. So this is Amelia Smythe. I'm the Interim Executive Director at USBC. And as Alyssa mentioned, today is the second in the Collective Impact webinar series. The topic today is the art and practice of facilitation, designing purposeful meetings. So with today's outline, we're going to have two different sections. The first we're calling Facilitation with Intention, and it highlights some characteristics of effective meetings and then some facilitation techniques or tips that you can apply. And then we're going to hear real-life stories from the Workplace Support Constellation. Cheryl Lebedovich serves as steward of that constellation, and Andrea Serrano has at times been her co-facilitator and is also a participant within that constellation. So they're going to hopefully bring some of the theory and practice we're sharing to life by sharing some stories that come out of their collaborative work. You'll notice that the intended speaker for the first section is Dr. Kimberly Broomfield Massey, and unfortunately, she needs to attend a memorial service today. So Alyssa and I are going to step in and share turns with speaking to the characteristics of effective meetings and facilitation techniques. Next slide, please. There we go. So facilitation with intention. So we want to think about why is it that meeting design matters. It makes really good use of participants' time if we think ahead of time and design intentionally how we're going to walk through the process together. It guides the process of focused discussion, and that in turn informs and supports decision making by the group. It establishes and more than likely attains the objectives that you set for the meeting, and it makes progress and defines next steps so that everyone walks away from the meeting hopefully feeling like that was time well spent and they can really see the progress that was made. And it avoids all kinds of trouble, like people balancing pencils on their nose or otherwise veering off course from the intended discussion. Next slide. So when we consider how to begin, there are two major components here. One is considering the people, like the participants who are in the room, and the other part is considering the arc of the process. So related to the people, hopefully if you're in the role of facilitator, you've come to know the representatives and the organizations that are at the table, so you can anticipate some of what are the hot spots. Also, what are the assets or the strengths that the people are bringing to that particular table? And is there any information or support that's needed by anyone in the room in order to help them prepare for the meeting? Some work is fairly light, and so you can just proceed and work it out together while you're there. Other times, if there's work that's delicate or more nuanced or heavy lift, people might benefit from being in contact on a more individual basis with a facilitator, maybe in small groups, to work out some things prior to coming together. Then the second part is really thinking about the group process. So we've identified 4 different goals towards any good meeting design. So one is building relationship and trust. One is co-creating a shared learning opportunity. One is designing a discussion of topics with a good recap and conscious framing questions. And then making motions or decisions for group agreements and external work. Next slide. And Alyssa.
Yeah, so one of the most important things about collaborative action is to build those strong relationships and build trust, and so that's really essential. And so an effective collaborative will have the following characteristics. So you're going to want to intentionally co-create that community over time, which includes a lot of honest communication and integrity, following through on doing what you said you would do. Really honoring individual participants' lived experience, knowing that everyone is, coming to this work with a different kind of background and lens. And also, it's really crucial to respect organizational constraints. So if people are coming here as representatives from their organization, that can be a really complex position for them to be in to represent the organization and participate in the group. So understanding that constraint. And I wanted to share this quote that I love from Liz Weaver at the Tamarack Institute. Authentic community change moves at the speed of trust. So you can't go faster than that.
Awesome, thank you. So some facilitation techniques of how do you build this relationship and trust. So as mentioned earlier, it's really helpful if the facilitator gets to know each organization and each representative. And it's a pretty complex thing to represent an organization. You might be the one in the room, or your participants showing up as the one in the room, representing all kinds of other agendas and a different set of constraints than what the group might be establishing together. So that person might need help in the process of going from your collaborative table back to their organization and being the conduit between the two. One of the things that can really help the group to find their center is if they co-establish community norms. We talked about this a little bit at the first webinar of this series. And one way to get there also is to invite the participants to surface either what concerns they have and or what hopes and wishes they have. And just getting those things out on the table and surfacing that makes it so people aren't sitting there with unspoken agendas or unspoken loads that they're bearing, and instead gets it all out on the table so that you can really start to work together with some better awareness of seeing one another clearly and being able to maneuver forward. Next slide for Alyssa.
Yeah, so one of the main things that is important in collective impact is having a shared learning. And so it requires a common understanding of a problem and a joint approach to solving it. Because you might have different organizations or individuals who see the problem in slightly different ways and have different kind of strengths that their organization brings to addressing it. So with collective impact, it's important to get to the point where it's using those strengths that everybody brings, but to have a joint approach to. So it takes a few discussions to surface common understandings of what that problem is. It may take longer to settle on what that joint approach is to addressing it, depending on the complexity and the dynamics of both the group and the problem. But it's important that shared learning experiences honor many ways of knowing, being, and doing, and recognizing that a diverse and inclusive table will inherently have diverse opinions and perspectives, and really making the space for the group to disagree but still listen and respect each other. And shared learning is an important time to surface what is known about an issue or a problem-solving approach, and then what else needs to be researched and learned together about how to address the issue.
So if you're going to then take this framework into life, we have at USBC developed what we call an incubation conversation. I think Cheryl and Andrea are going to speak a little bit more to that. But it's a time to bring everyone together and say, what is it that we know about the problem? So sometimes this is really emergent, hot topics, some things happening in maybe it's a political or policy landscape. Other times it can be, more reflective of, a longer term view of how this problem came to be. We also have tools to share about how to conduct a root cause analysis. So you're looking at more the systemic level of inequities within the problem. But one way of lightly getting there is to look together at who is harmed and who benefits from the structure that creates this problem. When you frame that question up, you help a group begin to think on a systemic level of how did this current situation come to be. Then you can unpack together what's been tried to solve it. What has already been either a policy piece or an initiative or a grassroots campaign to try to address it. And that can then lead to asking, what are the available structural levers for change? So do we know what they are, or do we need to do some research and come back? And although we've laid this out as a pretty, stepwise program, hopefully you can see it might take a couple meetings to be able to work through as a group all these different components, including coming back with new information once there's been some research. And ultimately, we want to get to the place where we're asking the question, what can we do together that we can't do separately? Right? So sometimes there's easy wins that a group can take on that can help with some cohesion, but collective impact really strives that collaborative actions require cross-sector collaboration in order to achieve the gains. We all need to be in it in order to move a particular lever. That's what we're going for, and that's the opportunity of collaboratives. Next slide, Melissa.
Yeah, and so kind of the meat of any meeting is going to be, group discussion. And so effective group discussions are framed in advance. The facilitators have framed up what they want to discuss, as well as giving information to participants as relevant ahead of time. And so good quality discussion during these meetings, you're going to lead with the relevant information. If you need to go over anything that was shared out, you want to have those constructive questions framed in advance so that you have those prepared to ask of the group. Need to allow every participant to have that opportunity to reflect, share, and question. So give them a little time to sit with it and share their reflections on it. Allow every participant to deeply listen, so to hear what everyone else is saying. Need to respect and seek to understand differences in perspective, approach, and capacity to act, both as individuals and organizations. And it's really crucial to disrupt any personal attacks or any harm that's being done, whether that's intentional or unintentional, to make it a safer space for participants. Amelia?
Yeah, so when we think about techniques in order to guide quality discussions, we find it's really helpful to walk in with some kind of recap of the shared learning. So if you've had a group walking through several different experiences together, whether they did some research and came back, you want to frame that up for them so they can all look at it together as they're going to move forward in this experience of collaboration together. So that could look like a material that you send out in advance that you ask everyone to review. It might look like a slide deck. It might look like a Word document, but in some way you want to recap the shared learning journey, and then you can begin to frame out some questions. So given what you've heard, given what we've learned together, what do you see and hear? Right? What does it remind you of? What does this make you feel? What additional information do you need? And ultimately, what is your personal and organizational capacity to take action on this? So again, these are, this could take more than one meeting in order to map through it. But what's really nice about this as a facilitation technique is it ensures everyone in the room has a chance to reflect on what it is that is emerging before the group as an issue and as a possible path forward to address it. Next slide.
So after the discussion has been done, you're going to want your collaborative group to be able to make decisions together. So having a clear decision-making process is really help support the long-term progress and towards the goals that the group has set. So a clear decision-making process is guided by an articulated approach. So really spelling out how and when and where the any decision-making is going to happen. Ensuring that the group has the information that they need to make the decision. And so that's part of what Amelia said in the last slide. It's sort of checking in that everyone has all of the information that they need. Ensuring that the group is clear on what is being decided. So making sure to kind of lay that out clearly about what this decision will entail. And then you want to have adequate time to apply this process. So, this also might not take place within one meeting. It might be something that starts and then happens later outside of a meeting or at a next meeting to make sure that folks don't feel rushed and that you're following that articulated approach. So this might include, taking the temperature of the group to see where people are at. It might include, a simple voting process. It might include discussions to come to consensus about a next step. But if you're laying that out clearly, that makes it a lot easier to move forward.
All right. So obviously this is very high level, but it is kind of the anatomy of good meeting design. And so we're delighted to use the next portion of our time on this webinar to lift up real life example of how does this live and move and breathe in a collaborative group over time, and how do they apply it and also find the culture of that group. So, these same facilitation nuts and bolts can be applied in many different settings to many different groups, and it will end up looking really different in a way that is specific to that collaborative. So today we're delighted to have Cheryl Lebetovich. She is our workplace support constellation steward, and on our staff she's a senior workplace support manager and policy analyst at USBC. And with her today is Andrea Serrano. Again, she's going to speak from her perspective as a participant. But Andrea is also the program manager at Reaching Our Sisters Everywhere, which is based in Atlanta, Georgia, but also takes Andrea and her colleagues many different places across the country to guide community transformer trainings. And Andrea is currently also serving on the USBC board. So take it away, ladies.
Thank you so much for that. Alyssa, you can go ahead and go to the next slide. The information that was provided was a wonderful overview on, the techniques and theory. And so what we want to do in this next portion is really kind of lay the foundation towards putting this into practice. So in this portion, we're going to really delve into how we laid out the foundation for the workplace constellation as we began thinking through working with each other as a group, identifying priorities, and so on and so forth. So really consider these next few slides those next steps you take after learning some of the theoretical pieces to put into practice. And know that we're not going to try to cover all 4 years that we've been in the workplace constellation in a 30-minute time frame. So these are really, really just laying the foundation to getting started from some of the theoretical pieces you just heard. Next slide.
Hi, everyone. This is Cheryl. Thanks so much, Andrea. So the Workplace Support Constellation first met in January 2014. So just like Andrea said, we've had quite a while that we've been working together. But that very first initial conversation happened in 2014, and it was what we call the pilot conversation. And together we brainstormed this giant list that you can see on the screen here of actions that were needed to better support breastfeeding employees. So this was a generative session where we were really dreaming big and trying to look at the problem from as many angles as we possibly could. And by starting out in this really big and broad space, we were able to sort of get out of our system all the ideas that we had and everything that was floating in our minds. And in a way, it sort of kept us out of getting too stuck in the weeds in an early conversation. But it also sort of served this sort of side effect where we began to kind of articulate, like, what would true universal support for breastfeeding employees really look like? Next slide, please. So the collective impact model, just as Amelia said, really urges us to focus on big actions so that address systems level issues. So solutions that are bigger and more complex than any one organization could ever manage alone. So that was one lens through which we sort of looked at that giant brainstorm list. But then, of course, there's also very real constraints on our time and our funding. So it's not possible to do all of the things that we might imagine we could do together. At the same time, we had a really rich group of organizations who wanted to work together on this issue, and there were so many strengths that each organization could bring to the table. So we needed to drill down to figure out what was the most urgent and the most feasible actions given the resources that we had. And we decided to begin by selecting one advocacy activity, one community of practice, or like a learning-centered activity, and one tangible deliverable. And as you can see with what we selected on this slide, we still weren't yet in the weeds of what this would precisely look like. So we really remained in that idea phase as we continued to explore and consider what work we could do together, and really come to a decision about whether and how to embark on forming a constellation on workplace support. Next slide, please. So for our next step, we asked ourselves the three questions that you see here on the screen. Are there advantages or disadvantages to working in a constellation around these ideas? It was important that we not overcomplicate things and that we take into consideration any limitations of the organizations at the table. So for example, not every organization that was involved in these early conversations was able to participate in advocacy work. We had federal agencies at the table. We had organizations that had decisions or restrictions around lobbying. So it was important that we surface those limitations and really just by naming the advantages and the disadvantages, we were able to better see, I think, which activities made the most sense for the constellation structure. Again, really looking at it through the eye of collective impact of being big enough, bold enough to warrant all of these organizations coming together in this commitment. The next question that we walked through was, who else do you think would need to be brought to the table to advance these ideas? And this question was critical. It's something that we asked ourselves again and again, and even continue to ask ourselves today, all these years down the road. And the reason is that the payoff honestly cannot be overstated. You'll hear more about this from Andrea in a moment, but really by evolving and growing the composition of the group in these early stages, by asking this question, we were able to co-create the constellation into a collaborative that was better informed, that was better able to take into account the diverse experiences of breastfeeding families, and evolve the systems and policies and people that surround and influence breastfeeding families. We needed to think about moms, and we needed to think about the healthcare providers that they turn to with questions, and we needed to think about the government agencies that enforce workplace breastfeeding laws. And by really thinking through who is missing from this conversation, we were able to get closer to finding answers to those important perspectives. But most importantly, this helped us to better focus our approach and our efforts on the actions that would make the biggest difference for the breastfeeding families who face the greatest barriers to continuing breastfeeding after returning to work. We wanted to be sure that we had diverse perspectives in the room so that we're making decisions that would truly support the field without unintentional consequences or side effects, because we simply didn't have a 360 view around what the impact of our work would be. The next question that we walked through was, what contributions or roles do you see for your own org or for other organizations that would add value to the constellation? And I think that this question really helped us to have a strengths-based approach and really maximize the assets that we had in the room. Working through these questions was by no means the end of our exploration, but it gave us a clear list of things to do and questions to answer and organizations to invite to our next conversation. And those were not short lists, I might emphasize. We've done a lot of learning and growing along the way. But I will say that after all these years in this work, I really believe that a good meeting has as much to do about what happens in between meetings as it does with what happens during the meeting. And so really walking our way through these questions and then following up to find the answers made a critical difference. I think it really served us in the constellation. And with that, I'm going to pass it back to Andrea.
Thank you. So after that first robust conversation that took place that January, the next following time we got together was August 2015. And being able to have brainstorm prior to allowed for, the parsing down of information, kind of narrowing where we could kind of center some of our focus in order to maybe engage folks to the conversation. So for that 2015 gathering, individuals were able to kind of self-select what constellation they wanted to go to and participate with. And so having a nice little excerpt of what the workplace constellation was kind of veering towards was helpful to get the people that decided to attend that August 2015 meeting. And so here pictured are some of the organizations straight from the sign-in sheet that attended that August 2015 meeting. And because we did such a wonderful brainstorming and was able to kind of center some of the conversation, we identified that it would make the most sense to highlight the Surgeon General call to action, step 14, around ensuring that employers establish and maintain comprehensive, high-quality lactation support and programs for their employees as kind of the spine to the work, right? Because laid out in that call to action were these strategy steps that were already there. And so this was really honing in on, there are resources and materials kind of already available to the field. How can we best utilize that without needing to reinvent the wheel, and then make the additional changes and focuses that need to kind of take place in order to start driving action? And so for those not familiar with this particular step, the implementation strategies were, develop resources to help employers comply with federal laws that require employers to provide the time and a place for nursing mothers to express breast milk, design and disseminate materials to educate employers about the benefits of providing more comprehensive, high-quality support for breastfeeding employees, develop and share innovative solutions to obstacles to breastfeeding that women face when returning to work in non-office settings, and promote comprehensive, high-quality lactation support programs as a part of basic employee benefit packages. And so once we kind of delve through those steps, we review them and try to identify whether these strategies reflected the incubation idea list that we've seen from what Cheryl had previously talked about. Were there any substantial changes in the landscape that has caused major progress around any of these strategies? We discussed whether there were any new strategies that have emerged or are emerging priorities, and whether or not any of these new strategies were reflected in our incubation idea list, right? So there was a bit of reflecting on past conversations. And I know sometimes when we have meetings and, we kind of go about this process, we might reflect on some of the minutes from a previous meeting, but not all the time some of the big takeaways. And I think allowing that space to reflect back on that list that we brainstormed through and have it be centered in how we moved forward in the conversation was essential to making and creating next steps. And so after we kind of worked through some of that dialogue, one of the next steps were to identify root cause analysis. So next slide, please. So in beginning the process of the root cause analysis, there are a few questions that we needed to ask ourselves. And these questions include, what problems are we trying to solve? Who is most marginalized by the problem, and where are they? Who is doing well despite the problem, if anyone, and where are they? Name institutions impacting a problem, name policies impacting a problem, which of the institutions and policies impact the root cause of the problem, and for example, Medicaid coverage in states, lack of transportation, lack of sick days, and so forth. And is there anything we know about the history of the problem that we must address in order to solve it? And so all of this is a pretty robust list here. It's not something that we can necessarily answer immediately there, but it provided some great questions for us to think through, to process before we try to start developing strategies to solve anything. You have to be able to try to map out a clear understanding of what are the issues and ensuring that those most impacted by the problems are voicing are able to kind of voice what might be the solutions are, in fact, if the problem we see on the outward end is truly an issue. And so one of the things that we did after this was we went through our list once again, kind of reflecting back on our list and moving back and forth between the analysis to start identifying some priorities so that way we can begin the phase of strategizing. Next slide, please. So in working through this process, the group determined that kind of some of the key next steps to strategizing was we mapped out that the first strategy needed to be increased understanding of employer responsibilities and employer rights under federal and state law through education campaigns that emphasize existing implementation resources. And how this came about is because while we had to work through some of the answers for those questions we asked ourselves, it generated great conversation. We talked about what are some of the real-time issues that we are hearing from the communities we're serving, and utilizing kind of that input within the room to help structure, okay, how are we going to prioritize? And when you are working towards any type of strategy, you want to make sure everyone's on the same page. Everyone is familiar, utilizing the same terms, understand what priorities and what's urgent, what needs to be addressed first. Like that requires that group consensus that had been talked about so well prior to this section. Then the next strategy we said was identify gaps in the current laws and work to expand protection for all employees, right? And so with these, we wanted to make sure we were clear on what do each of these strategies kind of mean. And so utilizing, some our discussion points, we knew that for strategy 1, conducting an education campaign by gathering existing resources and tailoring them for the audience and building and promoting a toolkit for the use would help kind of provide more clarity to maybe anyone that might be coming into the group for the first time and trying to understand the strategies, right? And for our second strategy, our description and understanding around that was the Supporting Working Moms Act, and how would it expand the break time for nursing mothers law to include workers classified as exempt under the Fair Labor Standard Act. So these descriptions were important because when you're doing something like strategizing, creating a group, and you're working with so many different organizations, and some of the fluidity that might go into working with multiple partners means that there might be people that come in and there might be that kind of leave for a minute because life happens. But when you kind of have these outlines, right? Things that kind of help frame where the work is going, it kind of helps to orient those that might be coming in to the conversation for the first time, that they're able to understand, okay, what is this constellation working on? What are they doing? And is this something that is of interest to me? Can I see myself participating in this work? And that's what this two strategy aspect kind of really helped us with. And to a piece, some of it allowed us to determine what could be something that's addressed on a short term or immediate basis, and what's something that we know on a long term, some long term efforts would take place. Next slide, please. So the next piece that happened was reflecting back on the answering those questions around the root cause analysis. And those conversations is what helped to raise a lot of these key considerations to the top, right? So when we talked about what problem we're trying to solve, after we got through a robust amount of conversation, it was really just centered around the lack of access to workplace accommodation for breastfeeding. And when we talked about marginalized, who are most marginalized, parsing down between the different types of workers, English as a second language workers, the different type of work environments. When we talked about who's doing well, we identified that some salary workers might be in positions where they're able to take those break times a little bit better. If nursing mom or pumping mother has access to a private office, that being something that helps her despite some of the laws or lack of enforcement that's there at the national level. Employees of large employers, so certain employers who are breastfeeding friendly, that have policies that support their employees. And then we talked about some of the institutions that impact this problem. And this allowed for brainstorming about who might need to be involved at the table, who needs to be invited that isn't currently amongst the conversation that we were currently having. And then policies that were impacting the problem, kind of parsed through the paid family leave, differences between federal and state, and working through also institutions that impact the root cause analysis. And the thing about having a Department of Labor there, and this is why it's so important to just have so much representation when you are kind of going through these conversations, is that the Department of Labor was able to highlight things like they don't get a lot of complaints from nursing mothers regarding, break time issues, not being able to have their break time. And so granted, this is around 2015, maybe it's increased since then, but what was being highlighted was that, without getting all those complaints, it makes it harder for the Department of Labor to maybe do work around that, right? And so then we talked about some of the real-time problems that some families may have in regards to reporting. So we were able to provide additional perspectives, like people who might work in right-to-work states where they don't feel the security to be able to raise up the issue around not getting accommodations, right? So those great conversations were able to take place across the spectrum of folks involved in this workplace. And then, of course, always acknowledging the historical complexities that might attribute to the problem that we are trying to address. Next slide.
That was awesome. I really appreciate all of that. It was really, the DOL piece was so critical, and I really just love how you described that, Andrea, because that meeting in 2015, when I really think about the constellation, that was such a game-changing moment for the group, where we really kind of came to some conclusions and made some decisions, and it was just a catalyzing moment. Really, really, really fun to think about that and how far we've come. For this next piece, we really wanted to talk about how important it is to ensure that we were being intentional about connecting the constellation to the larger system. So we wanted to make sure that we weren't having all of these conversations in a bubble. So on this slide, we listed some of the strategies that seem to have helped us along the way. And hopefully they can help others as they move forward with collective impact and other collaborative work. The first one was centering meeting goals. So in our meeting materials and communications, we were really clear about what we were trying to accomplish in that meeting. It was really about keeping our eye on the full arc of our big goals, just like Amelia described early in this presentation, while also remaining clear about where we were in that process in that given moment, and really what was needed to move us forward to the next step. This is a strength of many of the participants in our constellation, and Andrea in particular, of like, let's not get stuck. Let's make sure we're always really moving forward. And I've just been really grateful for what Andrea's brought specifically to that aspect. One of the things that we really noticed when we were reflecting together about the constellation was that in our early meeting materials, they were very formal, they were very detailed, much longer, and that this seems like it was really important and really helpful for these foundational conversations. And it's just interesting to notice that now we've been working together. There are 20 plus organizations participating in the constellation, but we're able to be a little bit less formal because we've built up our relationships and we've gotten into a flow. So we don't have any regrets about the formality of the early ones, and actually just kind of really we're recognizing how valuable that was, but that it might not always be a necessary part of meeting design and meeting prep. The next point we wanted to talk about was the constellation terms of reference, which really centered our equity approach. So once the constellation was formalized, this was a really important step that we've taken, is to develop what we've called our terms of reference document. And this outlines what are our goals, how do we work together, how do we make decisions. It makes clear what the expectations are for participants and how we can hold each other accountable. And including USBC as the steward of the constellation. It's really important checks and balances. And the main point that I would want to emphasize here is that this document was not created overnight. And we actually continue to update and adapt and expand it even today as we're moving forward. It's also not in its current form what we originally envisioned. Initially, we intended to create what we were calling our racial equity approach document. So we were trying to look at how we were ensuring that those who are impacted by the work we do have a voice in the work that we do. And we worked on developing this document over several meetings. And over the course of co-creating this document together, it really evolved into something much bigger than we originally envisioned, and it was in a really beautiful way. So while it took considerable time and attention, um, what it's meant is that when things come up in the world and there are new urgent action opportunities or threats, we're able to be, I think, a lot more nimble and responsive than we would otherwise be able to be, because we already have working agreements in place. And we've already talked through the lens through which we really approach this work. And we have decision-making processes in place. It can be time consuming. We've said a few times, like, collective impact moves at the speed of trust. It can be slow work, but when you get to the other side, it helps so much to just have clarity around our processes already in place. And then the other thing we wanted to lift up, and we've talked about it a few times, is really making a point to provide time and space for landscape updates during our meetings. So I think this has really served the constellation, because providing an opportunity for participants to lift up external shifts and changes that already have or have the potential to have an impact on the systems that we're trying to influence, it helps us keep a pulse on what's happening in the world. And it supports us to adapt our approach and be nimble and plan according to what's happening out there in the world. Change happens so quickly. And so even though this is really looking at a long-term goal and long-term work together, we also at the same time need to be prepared to change right along with the landscape. Next slide, please.
And so to pull it all in and keeping everyone tied in, because of course, like previously mentioned, when you're working with various organizations, various representatives from each organization, there's a lot of things that pull at our time individually. And so keeping everyone tied into the work and moving the conversation forward, there's an importance around celebrating small wins, right? I've always, I can speak for myself on this when I say, if I feel like I'm doing a lot of calls where we're only talking and there's no action, even I start to kind of falter off a little bit. And so the notion around recognizing that there are short-term objectives and goals that can be achieved and worked through and that can be celebrated. Like, yes, we've been able to accomplish this. Yes, we were able to, do this sign-on letter. Just those small celebrations and wins to just kind of keep people tied into the work and recognizing that their effort and their time dedicated to this process is essential and important and appreciated. Is a key component to our strategy within the constellation. And then of course having big goals. Yes, we want to save the world at a point in time, and that's the big goal here. I'm playing, but changing some of the policies that are affecting our families and communities, and really looking at our strategies and our the one that outlined as number 2, like a big goal of really just having an impact on the policies that better support families, regardless of whether they're hourly or salaried. Improve paid family leave, just different policies that at a larger aspect are things that are going to take this time and energy to work, and having that star in the horizon as represented by this picture as a part of our constellation is also important. So it's a nice balance between we have our small wins, we're going to celebrate those. We also know that there are larger opportunities and goals that we are trying to strive to obtain and be successful at, down the road. As another piece, it's a dual approach to this. And it's essential because none of this work can be done by itself. The input that's necessary is completely valuable to have different voices, and creating a space that is both inviting but also retaining of its participants is important. And so this is kind of where we want to leave you all on this laying the foundation of engaging in strategic work to implement some of the theories you've heard early on around facilitating groups. And hopefully these things kind of help get you going in your next steps.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Andrea and Cheryl and Alyssa. This is Amelia, and we do have a few questions that have come in. For this first question, I'm going to turn to Kintini Banerjee, who's on the USBC staff team serving as our Coalition Relations Director. Many of you know Kintini well and work with her regularly. So this is a question from Ann Davis. She asks, what other ideas might you suggest for a coalition striving to create an identity and encourage involvement when the idea of a coalition and its role as a convener isn't very clear to participants? Kintini?
Yeah, thanks, Amelia, and thank you, Anne, for this question. And we discussed today the foundational elements of a meeting. And one of the things, as a coalition leader and your facilitator at so many different meetings today, in your day job and in your role as a coalition. So just kind of for us knowing at the three things, like what is the purpose of this meeting, like what are the special outcomes that we want to achieve, and then once you know the purpose, then and what you want to get out of it, then the process becomes a little easier, because sometimes is it a brainstorm session? And Cheryl and Andrea spoke about how the incubation conversations happen. So a big part of the work that one does is also some kind of strategic learning. So if for a coalition that is looking at it, is looking at how do we make ourselves engage our larger membership as a coalition leadership, is like the purpose. As you're thinking about a meeting, think about it as being, how is this tied to our coalition mission, our goals? How does so the purpose of a meeting would be like being very focused and pragmatic on and derived from your larger overarching mission, and then that helps you set the context and give meaning to, okay, so this is our mission, these are our broad reaching goals. And if you don't have that, then you might even want to be engaging in that first, like having a brainstorm session, which is really about like, do we repurpose? Why are we here? What are we doing? And again, there are a lot of USBC capacity building that we do around how do you lead a brainstorm session? How do we do a more strategic guided process of like folks don't really know where we are? So today we spoke about if you know a topic, how do you come in and work or create a space on that? But if you're even going upstream to generate what should be some of our priorities, we, depending on the purpose of that meeting, you will want to design it in very specific ways. So we will, list a few. We have a lot of resources. So Amelia, Alyssa, Cheryl, and Andrea, I know that Rose does the SWOT analysis that you all do very much in looking at what are our strengths, how do we how do we build something on what are the assets already within a group or within a community. So we might be able to post some resources on that as well, but always here for some more customized capacity building as well. And I'm going to turn it over to Amelia to talk about, add anything to that, any member of the panel.
You continue, and thank you, Anne, for that question. We just have a couple minutes left, so there's two other, I think, fairly quick questions for Andrea and Cheryl. The first one is from Naomi Bar-Young, who's asking, how often does the constellation meet? Is it on a regular schedule, or is it triggered by some event?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's varied depending on really what's going on. So a lot of the kind of what you heard about today was more of the logistics, like figuring out how we work together. That sort of happened on a little bit more of a scheduled basis where it was planned far in advance. But then we also have a lot of times where we come together because something shifted and we need to meet and talk about it and figure out what we're going to do. So I think, Andrea, what would you say? We've gotten into a flow of probably meeting approximately every other month as a full constellation. The other thing, though, is that as the constellation has moved forward and evolved, we've actually developed 4 different subgroups within the constellation. So we also have subgroup meetings that meet periodically. So we have one that's focused on the education campaign strategy specifically. We have another that's looking at log gaps. We have another that's looking at community engagement, and one that's looking at students. So it really depends on the needs of those specific groups. And I think one of the questions we've really had, or at least I have, is the benefit of scheduling a stand-in call that's periodic and people can plan for it versus sending out schedulers and really adapting to what the majority of folks are able to attend. And we've tended to go with the sending out a scheduler and doing our best to accommodate as many as we can rather than a standing call.
Yeah, I second that. And the scheduler I found, I think has been the most helpful. I know it's not as fun to, have a little bit of that question mark, months moving ahead, but because of the need for fluidity and take into consideration that everyone's schedule, work time is a little bit different, right? Some work in the field, some are able to be in the office and be able to make the calls. So with the scheduler, it kind of helps, like, okay, for the maybe next couple of calls, can we do it on this particular time, than trying to lay it out for the full entire year.
Mm-hmm. Right. Thank you. I know we're right at the top of the hour. Some people may need to leave, including our speaker, Andrea, so thank you so much for that. And Cheryl, if you could stay on for one more question, and then we're going to make an announcement reminding everyone that registration is open for our conference this summer in June. So stay with us if you can. Otherwise, a little bit adieu to Andrea and anyone else that needs to pop off right now. Cheryl, would you be able to speak a little bit more to the decision-making process of the group? And in particular, someone's asked the question, how do you manage a group-led decision-making when there's also a funder that might have expectations for outcomes of the group?
That is a really good question. I think that there isn't a perfect answer. The approach that the Workplace Support Constellation decided to do is that we actually developed 2 different participant categories. So we have 3 organizations that participate as advisory organizations. And then we have the remainder are what we consider to be voting participants. So when it comes to different decisions that we need to make, our process that we've laid out in our terms of reference is that we have conversations, we come to the group with a proposal based on those conversations, and then if the decision is big enough, we have a formal written voting procedure, and that those who are participating as advisory participants do not vote in that process. Has worked pretty well. I think that especially come into play with like advocacy type decisions. I think one of the really tricky situations that we bumped on at the constellation level was that one of the federal agencies that actually participates in our constellation, they made a decision that we were responding to. So it was important that we be able to discuss that frankly without their particular influence.
Great. Thank you very much. So next slide, Alyssa. So as promised, here's the reminder announcement. Registration is open for the 9th National Breastfeeding Conference and convening on June 14th and 15th in Bethesda, Maryland. We hope that you'll be with us for the topic of taking equity from theory to practice, advancing inclusive and collaborative breastfeeding support. There's a fabulous lineup of speakers and many networking opportunities, and we hope that you will sign up if you have not already. We also have a Facebook page where you can get updates and get connected by following the event. So with that, we'll close out today's webinar, and thank you all so much for your time joining us.